This is another episode of Design Your Dream Home with Doug and Steve. And now the architects, Doug Patt and Stephen Chung.
You are watching or listening to the Design Your Dream Home podcast with me, Stephen Chung, and Doug Patt. Hey, Doug, morning. How are you?
Morning, Stephen. Good to see you, buddy. It's been a little while.
We've been on hiatus, and that's why I forgot the title of our show. But a little side note now, at the beginning of this podcast is actually when we talked about football for some reason. And you talked about being in New England and all the Patriots always win. You're always so depressed because you root for Philadelphia and you never win. And now look what's happened.
Yeah, I mean, you're hurting me already with the whole Philadelphia never wins thing. Goodness gracious.
Episodes, now we are at the point where we're in the precipice of New England versus Philadelphia.
Yes, we are. I tell you what, it's a battle of the Titans. It's kind of ironic that you and I are from those necks of the woods, and it's going to be interesting. I'm going to feel really badly for you on Monday morning.
You know what's amazing is that I'm curious to get our guest take because he's from New England too. I think we're not part of New England, but anyway, is that if we lose, I'll feel sad for a day, but actually, it's okay. We've won so much. Actually,
I knew it. I knew you. Okay, you know what? I'm not even. I got nothing to say because there's nothing I can say. So we'll just leave it at that. We're playing football. It's going to be a great game. Tom Brady's the best quarterback that's ever lived. We all know it, and we'll leave it at that.
I'm looking forward to a little bit of football today because I remember the first time that I met David. He was ready to go with me.
Yes,
talk about Island, and he was ready to go. And I said, why don't you introduce our guest today?
So let me take it away here. So today we've got David Andreozzi joining us. So let me give David a little introduction. So David is an award-winning and published architect. He owns Andreozzi Architects, founded almost 30 years ago in Barrington, Rhode Island. Do I have that correct? Almost 30 years?
Next year is our big party. We'll invite you.
Dude, that's unbelievable. Well, very commendable. So they specialize in historically based New England vernacular architecture. Specifically, they do new homes, they do renovations, they do additions. You can find them at andreozzi.com or on House under Andreozzi Architects. David is the current president of the New England Institute of Classical Architecture and Art. David was also the AIA's national chair of CRAN, which is the AIA's Custom Residential Architects Network. So that's one of their knowledge communities. That's actually where I met David at a CRAN event. I think I have this right, in Indianapolis back in 2011. So that was
Correct.
Quite some time ago. David and I worked a little bit later on CRAN TV, which you can find on YouTube. It's an internet-based series of videos created to educate the public about the importance of good design and the role of the architect. So I've known David for quite some time, and I know he's a very hard worker. He's also a very thoughtful guy. Privately, he's been an advocate of mine for years, so he's a friend, and I've enjoyed getting to know him. Now, when it comes to his practice, David refers to the work of his firm as, I think he calls it regional architecture. Most would say it's historically correct, it's traditional, and it's actually quite lovely. The scale of his projects, take a look at his website, can be quite large. So David went to RISD. Now I found this out from his website. I think this is correct. He grew up in a construction family. His father was a GC. His grandfather was also a GC. And another connection I have to David is, or that he and I share, is Greenwich, Connecticut. So David worked for Shope, Reno, Wharton in the mid-'80s. They're a high-end residential firm. They specialized in shingle-style architecture, as does David today. And that's where he met Job Moore. And as many of you know, I work with Job Moore up in Greenwich, Connecticut. And David is also married to Cheryl, who is his business partner. That is amazing in and of itself. So I've asked David to join us today and talk about what's on his mind of late. As you know, Stephen and I typically get together. We each have 3 tips on some subject related to architecture, And when we have somebody join us, we ask them to talk about 3 things that have been on their mind as they relate to architecture. And so David is an architect that's passionate about the profession and doing it well, also about style and design. So David Andreozzi, it is great to see you and welcome.
Thank you very much. I really appreciate being part of this whole show. Thank you.
Absolutely, buddy. Good to see you. So tell us a little bit about what's on your mind. Let's start with number 1.
Well, 1, 2, and 3 probably are the same, and we can zigzag around a little bit, but it's all sort of the same strain. Over the last 10 years, 15 years, I've been on this path of trying to educate people on the importance of regionally born architecture, and that's irrespective of style, whether it's modern or traditional. It just so happens that I benefit from the more traditional end, although I've done some more modern things. And so that on that path, as it's going through, it started out getting involved with a group called Korra that was set up by Dennis Wedlick, Duo Dickinson, and Jeremiah Eck. And what they wanted to do was educate people on the importance of architecture and design, period. So that was the first way that I started to get involved. Now, before that, I had sort of had this lonely feeling of not being loved by the AIA, paying my check every year, and really not being represented as a small residential architect, which I resented, hated, but kept paying the bills, kept showing up at the conferences, kept feeling lonely and shut out. So this Korra, I was hoping in the very beginning, might replace what I was not getting involved with, what I was not getting from the AIA. So Korra had about a 5-year growth period where we actually presented a white paper to the AIA in Miami, which was voted on and almost passed. It's a whole different story, but it was a wonderful move forward, and the amount of people that supported our movement, including the current president and vice president of the AIA, it was a pretty amazing path. At that point, a group of us left Korra and began working within the AIA. You mentioned CRAN. And we decided that we were going to get into the belly of the beast and actually try and change and improve the AIA to provide content to residential architects, which they didn't do. And I don't want to go too far, but it's kind of important in that by getting in there and creating havoc in a positive way and creating programs, we were able to do all sorts of things within CRAN in a very short period, including, and I was part of a group of people. It wasn't me alone. I was in leadership there, but I was part of a larger group of people. But we created a symposium. We created a book. We created tours. We created the YouTube series. It was one thing after another of trying to create support and content for residential architecture. And that's where Michael and I met, and Michael was involved with an amazing television show. And our sort of argument on that was that it was being presented sort of in a more modern-centric way. And so it was our position to, let's see the traditional and the residential. And we weren't being realistic, but that was how we met in a very nice and polite way. And then from that was this movement over to the ICAA. And I felt like I had done what I had to do at the AIA. And the ICAA is interesting because it is more traditionally based. And that really is where my sort of ethos is. And so that being sort of part one, I compare what I hope is going to happen in architecture in the next 20 years to what has happened in architecture, compared to what has happened in food in the last 30 years. So in 1986 in Piedmont, the slow food movement was born by Carlo Petrini. And his philosophy, their philosophy was, we need to start to appreciate where food is coming from. Eat it seasonally, and really concentrate on not the driving things from the outside, but what is locally and how it's actually grown. From that small movement, you in 2002, Alice Waters opens up Chez Panisse in Berkeley, California, basically talking about the earth and the food and California and regional cooking. And I'm skipping over many, many chefs, and I'm not even an expert in culinary, although my son is a young chef. And then Dan Barber pops up. Dan Barber, Blue Hill in New York, Blue Hill at Stone Barns near Sleepy Hollow in Westchester County, where he's actually working with his own farm and growing corns that are not GMO, based on original seed, original foods that haven't been grown in 100 years, and how it tastes different. And again, what's local and what's not. And then on the same level, there are these like aspects where you think about all of us for the last 5 years, not all of us, I'd say a good majority of us walk in and they're saying, is this an organic food? Are there GMOs in the food? I mean, think about it. Are there GMOs? Is this a heritage pig or is it not a heritage pig? All of the education that has occurred in a short period of time, 3 decades, and it's in the DNA of our culture right now that we care about what we're eating, so that most of the top chefs that we are winning all the awards, this is how they think and this is how they were taught. I argue that, or I hope that the same thing is going to occur for architecture. I start to see it, but it's got a long way to go. And my feeling is that, so I look at architecture as the way I've learned it is Vitruvius's commodity, firmness, and delight. And most of you know what that is, but for those of you who don't, Vitruvius lived around the birth of Christ, death of Christ, and he was an amazing Italian engineer. He was involved with wars. He was involved with architecture, and he invented this theory that great architecture is commodity, firmness, and delight. And commodity is the whole purpose. Is it a bowling alley? Is it a 2-story house? Is it a bank? The second part is firmness. Now, firmness is that the building itself needs to stand up. It needs to have a structural system. It needs to have a heating system. It needs to protect you from the environment. It needs to actually provide the function that a building does. So after it gets the award, it doesn't leak on your head. So that's okay. And then delight is the art. So the art can be anything you want it to be. And then his theory, at least how I interpret it, is that you can manipulate those 3 components a little bit, but if you manipulate them too much, it's not architecture. And it's no different than a cake rising in the oven. You can manipulate those components of a recipe a little bit, but at some point it doesn't rise, or the dough doesn't rise. So using that as a starting base, I've come up with this sort of theory that I've worked on, and it came when I was involved with CRAN, that I call cultural sustainability. And it's a blind code to judge all architecture, traditional or modern. And I believe that you start out with this Vitruvius's commodity, firmness, and delight, but then add to that paradigm vernacular, culture, topography, regionalism, and most importantly, natural resources and natural labor, so that you're looking and you're saying, what is it about the piece of architecture that I'm going to create that makes it American, that makes it New England, that makes it Rhode Island, that it makes it relate to Barrington, Rhode Island, that in the mid 1800s to the mid 1900s, created sand molded brick and sent them all over the country. And I know that sounds like a small thing, but when you think about the DNA of when you're creating architecture, that's what makes it different to that site than another site. And I think.
Hold on, let me stop you right there just for a second. So I've got an Instagram account. I posted all those facts about architecture about a year ago. One of them was about Rem Koolhaas and his Seattle Public Library. And you wrote a very nice paragraph or two criticizing that building. So could you briefly put that building into context relative to what you just said about how you look at architecture and judge architecture? Why didn't you like that building? For our audience, relative to what you're talking about, because I think it's important to define that. I think you do it well.
Well, I had an internal debate yesterday about Cooper Union, which would be the same argument, and we were comparing the Cooper Union building designed by Morphosis to the Guggenheim, and saying it was interesting that both buildings don't relate to their environment, but why is the Guggenheim sort of accepted and sort of beautiful? Wow. And the other two are pieces of architecture that you say aren't. And I argue that, well, I think that one of the problems where we are today is that people have been taught to use computer to create sculpture that is interesting, and then stick it in a place and add program in it. And to me, that process doesn't create architecture. It creates sculpture with program in it that doesn't relate to its environment. Right. And so to me, when you look at some great modern architecture, it's tough without showing pictures. RISD just
we'll show them.
Okay, so you can take a modern piece of architecture, and again, the color of the brick, the type of mortar. I mean, I have to be honest with you. Like, it's a lot tougher to be a modern architect and meet my standards than it is to be a traditional architect. And when you see it, it's quite a compliment. Whether it be the Roby House or whether you see or Falling Water. And Falling Water is an amazing story we could talk about for 3 hours. I mean, he basically, Frank Lloyd Wright spent his life trying to convince America that we need to have culture, history, and American humanity in our architecture, and basically fought the battle against international modernism, and then finally gave up and said, well, if you want to play that game, I'm going to do it. And he wasn't in a good place at the time, and comes out with one of the greatest pieces of architecture ever built. But if you look, as you visit Falling Water, you're visiting something that is made of the DNA of its earth and its surroundings, and it's being done with modernity. And that is very difficult to do. So it's much easier for me to look through my book of catalogs of columns and entices and say, I think this is a prettier curve than that, and I think this is proportionally better, or walk around a street and go, this is a Victorian community, and I think we should relate to it. So it's much easier for me to make a connection to today's society or today's inhabitants of an environment, and hopefully connect that architecture forward using that same DNA, than it is to say, I'm going to totally reinvent the language and hopefully it will match. And I mean, an example of that would be Corbu, that basically stripped it down. I'm sorry, we're going all over the place.
No, that's what I was thinking of, Corbu. I love Corbu.
Okay, so Corbu basically, and I'm not an expert in Corbu, but I know a fair amount about him, but basically reinvents architecture into elements of Pelosi and layering and he basically says, now I'm going to his argument is that I'm reinventing this based on the Parthenon and Greece and shade and shadow, and it basically it comes off as a shallow sort of excuse, and in their case that was just a wave stripped down, anti-ornament, and it doesn't sort of achieve that same level. You know, here's an interesting one. I'm losing it. Morphosis just did a house. I think it's called the Carpenter House, and I can't remember it, but I'm sorry that I don't. But they're one of their earliest houses, and it was the most beautiful modern house. And it was beautiful because they were able to have that balance between modernism and still an arched living room. And it was really trying to use those ties of history and home as opposed to we're going to just reinvent how you live and you're going to be living in a museum without furniture.
I'd like to hear you talk that way because I don't think I've ever heard you talk about contemporary architecture in a positive light, or let's call it modern architecture positive light, and you just did. And I think you explained yourself pretty well in terms of why you like certain buildings. So that's helpful.
So it's really interesting to hear you talk about and I looked at your work and I know your work and I your houses are beautiful. I think that when we first met you thought that I was trying to promote a certain style of architecture with the television show, when in fact that wasn't really the idea. And I think you learned that it was really more about trying to understand what architects do. And of course, every case of our show was the buildings were somehow beautiful buildings that had fulfilled their program and the people that later enjoyed them. So that could be certainly someone who lives in one of your homes or the Dallas Cowboy football stadium. So I'm glad that we kind of, at least you afterwards, you said, okay, I kind of understand where you're coming from. But I really appreciated your passion that you were coming at me and with your kind of your approach. And it's interesting when you explain it. I'm not opposed to any of the things you talk about. I guess I would be really curious to see what you do if, because you're in your home state and your home turf. But if, let's say, someone came to you and said, hey, listen, we're doing a vacation house in Sarasota, Florida. We love you the way you think. Will you do a house for us on the beach there? Would you take that on? And then how would you approach it given what you're saying? Because you would be looking for the DNA of that place, right? Suddenly all the books from Rhode Island and New England would not serve you. Is that kind of how you would approach it?
You threw me a watermelon. I love it. Okay, so if you go to my website, there's a house that I did on the island of Abaco in the Bahamas. It's a compound for a family, a large family, and when we started that process of designing that house, we showed up on the island of Abaco. My client rented a boat. And we basically went from small island to small island, taking pictures, trying to figure out what the DNA was of the architecture in the Bahamas. And we came back to the office and we started to rip it down and go, okay, it's sort of the southern plantation that had gone over at the hundreds of years ago into the islands as they were pushed out of the United States. People were pushed out. And it was, and then into that, there's this Junkanoo true Bahamian architecture, and we were looking at the porches and how it's built. And honestly, I'd like to believe that we sort of created an architecture that really isn't there right now. But if you look at each individual piece, it's clearly made of the DNA of the Bahamas.
That's a great answer. We'll have to. Do you have that? We'll get photos on that for the video, right?
Definitely.
Oh, absolutely.
Excellent.
So, David, if you, I know we talked about kind of skipping around points. We clearly talked about one thing. We talked about a second. Is there a third thing that you'd like to discuss today, or an idea, or a gripe that you'd like to share with us about architecture?
I think it's an interesting way to look at architects. Is that some architects are designing, looking for awards, and others are designing for their clients, and they really are different. And I'm an architect that when a client comes in, I'm looking and trying to understand what it is about that client and their relation. If it's a couple, about their relationship, about where they fell in love, where they honeymooned, what it is about how they play in their house and how they entertain, and their heritage, all of those things, as I'm trying to weave in what sort of architecture I'm creating for that client. And that's very, very different from the alternative, which is a client that goes to an architect because they create a beautiful, modern, contemporary image that in some cases they've branded. That is a los. That is, it's obvious by the imagery which national architect or which regional architect has designed it, because they're so busy creating a brand, and then they go sell that brand. And it's interesting how the two clients are really looking for two different types of architects. I mean, personally, I view architecture that while I appreciate the fact that people will go and want to buy an architectural service to get an award and buy a piece of sculpture, the real role of an architect, as far as I see it, is to educate and protect the client through the construction process. So that's number one. And more importantly, is to create, to protect their resale value, because the resale value at the end really is like, that's in many cases that's their nest egg. So when somebody says, oh no, you need this and it's going to be cool and we're going to win an award, that's great. All those things are right. They won the awards, everything's on the wall. How's that going to work out for you 30 years from now when you overbuilt a house per square foot that isn't built of the highest quality materials, using again, culturally identifiable symbolism that other people are going to want to buy, so that you can sell that house. And so that it's sort of a way that we look at architecture here in the office, is that our job is really to be shepherds of the client and protect their nest egg, as opposed to sort of the alternative. Wow,
what a great answer. I find it wonderful that you're so thoughtful about your clients, and this came through. And I didn't get into it, but when we worked on Crayon TV together, you wrote the scripts, and then I edited the scripts. So they were kind of typically your brainchild, and then I got to work on them, and it really came through when we worked together about how important you think it is that we are working for specific human beings and providing a service for those people that is not timeless, but lasts a long time. So it's not just about creating these objects that are monuments to architects and personalities. They're actual objects that are not just sculpture, that are habitable, as Brancusi used to say, but they're much more than that. And they have a lot to do with their surroundings, the places that they're made, and the materials that they're made of. So we're thinking a lot about you. So you're bringing the architect back into architecture, I think, and also bringing the clients in a very deep and profound way. So that was a great answer.
So let me ask you a question. Let me ask you. I have to leave?
I wanted to follow up on that. And I also wanted to throw John Ish in there, that was part of our team.
John was great.
He was awesome. But one of the problems that we've sort of that we discovered while analyzing this is that because modern architecture, which is again done beautifully, is beautiful, but is really the only architecture that seemingly is celebrated by the famous glossy magazines. I think the majority of the other people that are 90% of the other people that like other types of architecture feel that maybe they don't need one of those. They don't need they don't need an architect, because look, the architects are all like Zaha Hadid. I don't know that I want to build a Zaha house in my neighborhood. But there are people that do. But that's the minority. Well, here's the problem is that, and that's for our profession. This was so upsetting with the AIA, and I wanted them to get on board, and they started to. But is that they represent all architects, and these other architects aren't being represented. And so that when an average person goes, I want to design a house, their thought is that, well, maybe I'm just going to go to a draftsperson or a decorator or a designer. And so we all need them, all part of the process. But I was trying to encourage that even if you're changing a front door on a historic house, you need to call up the architect and go, will you come over and consult with me for a couple hours? I'll pay you whatever you want, and you can help me so I make sure I put the correct door on my federal style house. And I really believe that over the last 3 decades, this vision fission, what's the word? This break has occurred, so people don't even feel like they should call an architect. There's a disconnect.
It's interesting because you mentioned 90%, and the way I look at it, given the work that I do is more modern, contemporary. I think the architects that you're disparaging, that's probably more me. But actually, the reality is that
we're all about
is that 90% of the people actually like the work that you do. That it's the glossy magazines and the AI that like that contemporary architecture that you talk about. But really what I find is that everyday people, they much prefer your work to mine. And let's say, I don't mean you personally, but stylistically, what you do, the beautiful shingle style work, the variety, the materials, all of those are far more appreciated than a simple box, a glass, this kind of architecture. So why do you feel somehow it's as if the percentages were reversed or inverted? Because I think you're winning. To me, especially in New England. I mean, there's very few people that want contemporary. The ones that I know would love to live in one of your homes, not something that I would do for them, which is why I have to go to Sarasota. You know what I mean? I kind of, where does it come from? Is it the magazines? Is it the organization? Because clearly you have a great portfolio of work. There's a steady stream of people that love and appreciate the kind of work that you do. So I kind of wonder where it all comes from, that feeling you have.
So you threw me another good one. Thank you. So here's my confession.
Yeah.
So on my website it says I'm an award-winning architect, right? But the reality is that I won 3 AIA awards, okay? And I have not won a jurred AIA award in all of my years. And so think about that. I mean, and I've had people come up to me. Anyway, but here's the thing: the 3 awards that I won were when I was starting out in my career, and at Second Beach. I think First or Second Beach in Newport, the local AIA said, we're going to be giving out 4 awards, and we're going to let people that are walking up and down the beach on a sunny day come in and vote on 4 categories. Okay. And I took that picture behind me, which is my very, very first commission, which was not loosely, but it was based kind of on the Low House, but a more Victorian version, really concentrating on. But the symbolism really was of that, thinking about the chimney connecting to the Mother Earth, and the chimney provided the heat, it provided the food, it provided the stability through New England winters. There's something symbolically about that chimney and shingles that to me I think about when I'm designing a house. I put that single picture up in this big auditorium or this big room beside the beach, along with about another 75 other pictures, single pictures, and people went around and they voted for the 4 categories of all of them. There were some firms that had 15 or 20 pictures up. I had 1 picture. At the end of the day, I had won 3 of the 4 categories. Of all of the people that walked off the beach, that 1 picture connected to their soul as, I think, most historic, most representative of Rhode Island, and maybe the house that you would most want to live in. I'm paraphrasing, and those were the AIA awards that I won. And it's exactly sort of to your point, is that somehow I believe that I do connect to the public, and I wish that the AIA realized that there's this huge mass of architectural people out there that they could bring into the fold and represent them and get more dues from, but they need to stop. It needs to be more inclusive. So anyway, what was the original question? Because I didn't answer your question.
I think you did answer the question. I mean, I think what you're talking about is the fact that it's in our DNA in some ways. I mean, it has a lot to do with where we live, but I think it also has to do with what's recognizable and who we are as people and what we see as comfortable, and it's part of us. So, I mean, that's how I would paraphrase what you were saying.
Yeah.
Don't tell me that your own house is a glass box. Like Peter Reisman, you know that Peter Reisman, the famous modern architect, does these incredibly abstract houses, but his own house is like a little Victorian. So tell me that you live in a little glass box, Corten steel.
It'll fix everything for you.
Yeah, Cheryl and I built our house in 1990, and I have what I call an Andreozzi architecture light.
Okay.
So
awesome.
I certainly can't afford what I design for most of my clients. I mean, I will say it's a little bit about my practice. If you go to my website, which is andreozzi.com, you see, and it's a very bad website, but if you push all the dots on the bottom, you'll see these big houses, right? So, and the illusion is that I design only big houses. If you really go to my Facebook page, what you're going to see is that 50 to 60% of my work is all smaller projects. So I just don't want people to think that this is a practice that is only building mansions for the rich. And I think that you know that when you go have a house professionally photographed, I mean, 2 days cost you $5,000 or $6,000. So you're not really doing that for smaller projects.
Yeah,
so those are the ones you see on the website. But I think that's important.
So, David, I want to thank you for being here. I think it's probably time to wrap up. What do you think, guys?
Yeah, I agree. Fantastic.
Okay. So, David Andreozzi, I want to thank you for being here. David is clearly a very insightful guy. He's a very passionate guy. Remember, Andreozzi.com. He's also on Facebook, on House under Andreozzi Architects. It's great to see you, buddy, and I look forward to catching up in person next time. This has been Design Your Dream Home with Doug and Steve. Thanks for watching or listening or both. Remember to shoot us an email, ask us a question. We hear from you guys on YouTube, and we love getting questions. So keep it up, and we'll see you next time.